Remains on the economy. It's the big question of our times, and day after day, the forecast is gloomy. The latest, of course, came when the IMF yesterday forecast that the Indian economy will shrink in fiscal 2020-21 by 10.3%. That's double of what they had predicted just 3 months ago. But there are some piece of good news. The IMF suggests that there will be a bounce back in 2021-22. The big question, though, is how will this revival take place? How dire could it get? What are the risk factors? Those are some of the questions that I have posed to the IMF's chief economist. Dr. Gita Gopinath is my top focus this evening. Take a look at our special interview on the state of India's economy and the world economy in the age of COVID-19. And joining us now is a very special guest. I'm joined by the IMF's chief economist from Washington, D.C., Dr. Gita Gopinath. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Gopinath. I want to come to first the big talking point of your World Economic Outlook report that you released on Thursday, which says that the Indian economy will contract 10.3% in the financial year 2021. Now, this is much worse than what you predicted, the 4.5% degrowth in June. What explains this dramatic change?
Rajdeep, what we've seen obviously in India over the last several months is the surge in the pandemic, the longer duration of containment measures that has necessitated. And because of that, we saw what happened in the second quarter, which is with the exception of net exports and public consumption and the agriculture sector, there was a very broad-based collapse in activity everywhere. So compared to June, going forward, we expect to see a slower recovery, which is why if you add the growth over the 2 fiscal years, India falls short by around 2.4% relative to the 2019 levels, if you include this fiscal year and the next.
The reason I'm asking you this is a lot of government officials tell us the worst is over. But when you think of a contraction in the economy of over 23% in the first quarter, April to June, and now when your numbers come, the RBI numbers come, the World Bank numbers come, it suggests that if at all there is any recovery, it's very slow.
So, the April to June numbers were dire, and we will see with the reopenings there will be recovery. So the numbers that come in the next quarter are going to be positive. They're going to be obviously not in terms of quarter on quarter, we're going to see growth. But indeed, the pace of recovery that we have is gradual, and you're not getting back to 2019 levels until 2023 or so, around then. So this is a long walk. The second thing is this is not just a hit to the near term, but it's a hit over the medium term, and that's true for many countries. For instance, in the case of India, if you compare what we had projected for India before the pandemic in 2025 to what we are projecting now, India's GDP is going to be about 13% lower in 2025 than what we had projected pre-pandemic. So this is not a transitory effect. What we are forecasting, and this is true for many countries, is a much more medium-term effect in terms of lost output.
Now, I take it that, the pandemic has changed the rules of the game across the world. But from what I can gather, India seems to have suffered more than many other emerging market economies. At double digit, at 10.3%, it appears that India has taken a bigger hit. In fact, even within the South Asian region, and this has become a contentious talking point again, Bangladesh seems to be doing better than us.
The pandemic has hit India, hard. Initially, the government responded quickly with containment measures, but of course, you did see that initially it looked like maybe this would be controlled, but it hasn't, and it has increased, and it still remains a problem. So as long as the health crisis is there and of the severity that it is in India, you will expect to see very large hits to activity. But with reopenings, you will see a return. Now, of course, there are pre-existing conditions in India too, in the terms of the strength of the financial sector, and we have issues over there, and that can weigh on the recovery going forward. Similarly, vulnerabilities in the corporate sector. So all of that are what will, dampen the recovery to some extent. But again, lockdowns have hit growth in many parts of the world.
Again, the reason, from what you're saying, 2023 at the very earliest, before we actually see something that resembles a full recovery, that really shatters this theory of a V-shaped recovery that we keep hearing of. Every time, again, one speaks to government officials, they say, we're going to go through a V-shaped recovery. The next 2 quarters will see a dramatic rise. Your outlook doesn't suggest that. You're being much more pessimistic. You're saying it's only at best in 2021-22 fiscal that the economy will sort of revive by about 8%. But that's again on a very low base.
So yes, so there is no V-shape, that's for sure. Right? This is not a V-shaped projection. What it will look like is that you will see a rebound in growth, just coming back from the depths. But then that's a partial recovery. It will not be all the way back to 2019 levels, even by end. I think we have it going at least until sometime in 2022. And so no, this is not a V-shaped recovery. Somewhere more between a V and an L in terms of the recovery, and it's gradual. This is, and as long as this health crisis isn't over, the downside risks also are many.
So in a sense, would you say that India got something wrong in the last 6 months? Are you willing to go on a limb and suggest that maybe there are things that India could have done to soften the blows? Or do you believe there's an inevitability to what's happened over the last 6 months?
I mean, this is an unprecedented crisis, and the old toolbox doesn't apply, doesn't really work, and countries are having to grapple with it, deal with their country's specific circumstances. So I don't want to go into specific criticisms of any kind, but we can obviously talk more, constructively about what can be done next. And I'm happy to have a discussion on that.
Okay, so what can be done next? What do you believe India needs to do over the next 2 quarters to somehow or the other get back on this path to recovery? We've lost 2.1 crore jobs according to some surveys, and that's a lot. So what can we do? Where are the green shoots, the rays of hope that you see going forward? What do we need to do?
So firstly, Rajiv, in terms of the size of the fiscal package that has been deployed, it is quite considerable at 7% of GDP. But the portion that's in the form of direct spending is a very small fraction of that. A lot of it has been in the form of liquidity support measures, credit guarantees, loan guarantees, and much less in the form of direct spending, which is putting income directly in the hands of low-income households, directly in the hands of SMEs. And I would say that has to be rebalanced. So I would say that we need more. India needs to do more in the direct spending, component. And you can do that also by expanding the coverage of the people who are receiving the income. So kind of cover the urban poor, cover migrant workers. And also several of these schemes have either expired or are going to expire very soon. So you do want to extend that. So that's one big piece of it. The second piece is on monetary policy. There's been considerable steps taken. We see the scope for further easing. Now, there is this transitory effect that's come from food prices on inflation, but once that softens, and because there's such a low level of demand, we would expect to see inflation come down. There would be space to do more easing. And the third piece of it, and this is the government has announced several measures, is on public investment. And that would be another, a big step that can be used to bring back growth and bring back jobs.
Because, the real concern seems to be with demand. How do you stir consumer demand? How do you revive consumer demand? How do you put money, as you said, in people's pockets? Would you, therefore, support more direct income transfers? Do you believe that is one way forward?
We absolutely see the scope for doing more in terms of direct income support relative to what's been done so far. What we're seeing around the world is those measures seem to be more effective than the more indirect measures, which take the form of liquidity support, because to a great extent, this crisis is less of a liquidity crisis and is turning to more of a solvency crisis. And so it's hard, loan uptakes will not be that great. Now, I'm not saying that, just to be very clear, those are very important measures. Deploying those, the liquidity measures, the credit guarantees are very important. But I think the formula has to change a bit more towards the direct spending side.
Because, you had a piece of advice for Prime Minister Modi earlier saying India needed to expand its testing capacity, spend more to support vulnerable people, small and medium enterprises, recognizes this as an opportunity to strengthen reform. Are you seeing all of this happening? Do you believe in a sense that there is a recognition now of the scale of the crisis and therefore all these steps are being taken in your view? Or is India still a little behind the curve?
Well, we've certainly seen some big announcements on the more medium term or the reform side, the supply side aspects with the farm bills and the labor bills, and those are significant step forward, and that would help with bringing back growth. These were needed changes, these were needed reforms. Of course, again, a lot also depends on the implementation, but these are significant steps now. But there is a near-term crisis also, which has to be dealt with. And that's where I would say that more can be done in terms of, the measures that they already have been deployed, kind of expanding it to more people, extending the timeline for it. And also to reevaluate some of these liquidity schemes, just to make sure that they are actually, working as one would have hoped. Because what we're seeing around the world is that there is a bit of a gap between the announcement of measures and the actual uptake of these measures.
I had mentioned Bangladesh in between, Dr. Gopinath, because IMF projections for South Asian economies 2020-21. India minus 10.3%, Sri Lanka minus 4.6%, Bangladesh 3.8% positive. Now, if Bangladesh's per capita GDP, you seem to suggest, could actually outstrip India in this year. Now, that has, of course, created a lot of buzz here, because the thought that Bangladesh is now outstripping India is an obvious source of concern. What does that reflect? Has Bangladesh got something right in recent times that perhaps India has not?
Rajiv, just stepping away from Bangladesh specifically, we have seen countries in the world, including Vietnam, Bangladesh, Vietnam, they are low-income countries, but they've been able to contain the spread of the pandemic much more effectively, and that has been an important, factor. I don't think we should sit on judgment at this point about, exactly why some people got it right and wrong, but and we will learn about which measures work better going forward. But India is a large country and it's a major economy. In terms of scale, it's not exactly comparable. I think we should focus on India here and see what needs to be done to come out of this, really dire crisis. But you have to keep in mind that India is a country with a lot of potential. 3 years ago, 3 years ago, or maybe even more recently, it was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has that potential. It has a young demographic. And that's what one should leverage to come out of this crisis with the right policies.
I'll come to the global picture in a moment. I just want to understand from you, the 5 trillion dream, though, the $5 trillion economy dream, though, seems to have received a major setback in that sense.
Everywhere in the world, the projected improvement in living standards has had a major setback. And, that's true in terms of for India too. But again, this is a crisis that was unprecedented, a pandemic that the world didn't see coming. And, at this point, you have to get the policies in place to make sure that you come back to your 2019 levels and then figure out the reforms that's needed to expand on growth.
You've titled your report A Long and Difficult Ascent, looking at the world economy. And it appears that most of the advanced economies have been particularly hit. The US 4.3% negative, the UK 9.8% contraction, Brazil 5.8%, South Africa 8.0%. China is the lone exception. What explains this? If you look at your numbers, China is the one economy which seems to have been able to sort of climb out of any recessionary spiral.
I mean, China is quite an outlier, Rajdeep. So if you look at between 2020 and 21, China will grow by 10% relative to 2019, while pretty much everywhere in the world they're going to be below 2019 levels. So you can see it's a very large difference. What can explain it? One, they have been found very effective in controlling the spread of the pandemic, and they did it very quickly. They did it early on, and you did see some, recent spikes that happened, but they were able to take localized measures. They've been very aggressive at contact tracing, testing, and that has worked very well. The second piece that's worked well for them is the big increase in global demand for medical equipment, for office equipment, because people are now working from home. And that has had a positive effect on China's exports. And a third piece is their public infrastructure spending push. That's brought about the growth. But of course, we do worry about a very unbalanced recovery in China because it's being driven mainly by public spending as opposed to private demand, especially with consumption. Private consumption still remains well below pre-pandemic levels, but it is recovering.
So China is one outlier. The other outlier, and you mentioned it briefly, is Vietnam. I mean, is it that these smaller emerging market countries have been able to handle the pandemic better? Is that where perhaps India's size has gone against it? The fact that we had this very severe national lockdown, which completely sort of finished any form of economic activity for 3 months. Is there a lesson from the smaller countries like Vietnam?
I think the lesson is that prior experience matters. And a country like Vietnam had the SARS epidemic, and they learned from that. And so they had the systems in place to very quickly respond to it. And so parts of the world that had that history of experience, they kind of got the steps right very quickly early on. And they've been able to deal with the pandemic better. I think for many other countries, this has been a surprise. And even now, it's really interesting. I mean, I'm in constant touch with epidemiologists, and the knowledge in terms of how does the transmission happen, who's most susceptible to it, why in India, despite the number of cases being high, the recovery rates are much better, the fatality rates are much better. There is not that much understanding still about it. So this is a difficult crisis to deal with.
Now, when you look at the global economy, the IMF expects global economy to contract 4.4% during 2020, but you made an upward revision of about 0.8%. We heard the managing director say the other day the world economy was less dire than expected. Presumably, all of this is based on the hope that we will have a vaccine by early 2021, because if we are still in pandemic mode, let's say next year this time, then all your numbers again go astray. Am I correct?
No, the upgrade was because of, the second quarter in many advanced economies, while awful, was somewhat less awful than we had projected. And we saw strong signs of recovery in the third quarter. So for the advanced economy group as a whole, we've had revisions for the US and the euro area. And that's what drives to an important extent the upgrade that we have. The assumption going forward right now is that while, yes, there might be discoveries of vaccines, that it will take until the end of 2022 to bring local transmission levels down to low levels everywhere in the world. So this is not going to happen in early 2021. I mean, this is going to take a while. So that's already in our baseline. Now, the question, of course, is that is it going to be worse? Is there going to be a very serious second wave, and that's going to re-trigger lockdowns in many parts of the world? I mean, that's the part that would have a bigger effect on our estimates.
As I said, I spoke a little earlier about China itself. Is there a worry that, as the Chinese economy strengthens, other economies struggle? Do you see a mismatch? In India, we are seeing a wave of nationalism against China, and that's sort of, people are talking of restricting imports from China, go through the route of import substitution through protectionism. Is that, do you believe that's feasible, that the world must take China along with it? You need a strong China?
Well, I don't like the idea of protectionism at all, in the sense of, even before this crisis, countries were putting up protectionist barriers. During this crisis, we've seen restrictions on trade and investment going up. And all of that takes a hit on economies, on their own economies, and on their own productivity. I mean, companies are part of global supply chains, and most exporters are also importers. So it's very hard to have the same level of productivity to be able to do the same scale of exports if you're not going to bring in imports too. So now there are issues with the global trading system. There is a need for reform of the WTO. There's no doubt about that. But it still has to be a multilateral solution. It has to be a rules-based system, and countries need to really work together to come up with a better system that deals with the issues of the day.
Because the worry is post-pandemic, countries have either gone inward into some form of nationalism at one level, and on the other side, inequalities within countries are widening. We're seeing that, as I said, with the high job loss figures in India, there are concerns of widening inequalities. Is that something that you're concerned with going ahead, that what the pandemic has done is a widening of inequalities and a possible blow to multilateralism and a growing focus on nationalism?
No, we're very concerned about that. I mean, inequality was a concern before this crisis, and it's growing. I mean, everywhere in the world, within countries, across countries, and the poor are getting poorer. I mean, after 2 decades of all the gains we made in terms of bringing poverty rates down, we now have projections for 90 million additional people entering poverty relative to what we would have expected just this year. And this is extreme poverty. We're not even talking about, this is extreme deprivation. So this is a major issue. I think the big solution at the international level has to be greater collaboration to end this health crisis. The problem is now less science. I think there are vaccines that are going to come out. There's going to be better treatments. There's better testing. The problem is in economics. There's not enough production. There's not enough possibility for distribution worldwide to kind of end the health crisis quickly. And that's, I think, the area where greater collaboration is needed.
So going ahead, what are the major risk factors you see? As I said, the question, I started off with that in June you predicted a contraction in this country of about 4%, and now it's gone up to 10%. So you've doubled your projection. Are you worried that at this rate, come 3 months from now, your next projection could possibly again go out of shape? Or do you believe that there is genuine signs of recovery? What are the risk factors going ahead to all your numbers?
Yeah, Rajdeep, in the case of India, yes, we've had big changes. But if you look at the global level, in our first forecast that we did in April, we had the world at -3%. That was a 6 percentage point downgrade. And everything since then has been within the 1 to 2 percentage point range. So you can see that, that we can see economies, it can be bad, but we're also seeing signs of recovery. In some countries, of course, we've seen much bigger, surprises, and India has been one of them. But I think the bottom line is that without an end to the pandemic, without knowing how this virus is going to affect lives and people's perceptions of risks when they go out to work, we don't have the fog of uncertainty is going to remain dense. But again, let's hope that we will have the vaccines and treatments and that we'll have enough of it for the world.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask, because in your blog you've used 2 words that were interesting: uncertain and uneven. The fact is that the Great Depression in the 1930s, and we're in a situation very similar to that in terms of what's happened to global economies, it took years for the world to recover. Do you see, therefore, the possibility that this recovery could be much longer than what we are talking about today? I'm sorry to sound negative.
I mean, there are downside risks, but there are also upside risks. If we have a quicker end to the health crisis, yes. And in terms of the great comparison to the Great Depression, Rajdeep, I don't think this is that episode overall, in the sense the global GDP was much bigger, closer to 10%. It took many years to hit the bottom. Here, we have seen countries hit the bottom, and we're seeing a bounce back. Now, all the work has to be made to make sure that you have a sustained recovery. And it's not easy. There's no easy solutions here, but, I think it just needs all our hands on deck.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one final personal question. You took charge at the IMF about 1.5 years ago. World was gearing up for a world economic slowdown, and now you've got a COVID-hit globe. Has this been and 18 months which has sort of woken you up and sort of made you sort of just live in the present rather than predict to the future? How tough has it been for economists?
Well, I mean, to be the chief economist at the time of one of the worst crises in many, many generations, I'm not going to lie, has been quite a challenge. But at the same time, it's also personally satisfying to be able to do something useful in your life that hopefully has some good for the world.
Dr. Gita Gopinath, thank you very much for joining me and giving us a sense of what lies ahead for India and the world economy. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much. Stay well.
Thanks, Rajdeep.